Why we love the Tang Dynasty, exploring the history and charm of what's seen as one of the greatest imperial dynasties in Chinese history. Episode 16, The Calligraphic Stars of the Tang. In this episode, we're taking a look at the amazing calligraphy of the Tang, which is seen as a highlight of this fabulous dynasty. I'm Bob Jones, and in this podcast series, we're getting to know the Tang Dynasty and attempting to discover how, at its height, it was possibly the most prosperous, interconnected, and innovative country in the world, with a rich and influential legacy that survives to this day. Even though block printing had been invented by the time the Tang Dynasty came along, like any new technology, it didn't really take off until after the Tang had come and gone. For the vast majority of the scholar officials, the literati of the Tang, handwritten manuscripts were still the go-to method of disseminating information. But don't get the impression that scrolls of paper were the only medium used. Calligraphy also found its way onto paintings, murals, and tablet inscriptions. We already know that there were a great number of administrators, writers, and poets in the Tang Dynasty, which inevitably meant that there was a huge amount of writing going on. The Tang Dynasty was the era of calligraphy. Perhaps even more importantly than these people who needed to use calligraphy on a daily basis for work or creative expression, it was also a much-loved imperial skill. For example, Tang Dynasty Emperor Tang Taizong Li Shimin was a huge fan, as was Emperor Tang Gaozong Li Zhe and his wife Wu Zetian, who herself later became empress. But also Emperor Tang Xuanzong, who, in between introducing the Kaiyuan Tianbao coin and causing mayhem during the An Lushan rebellion, also found time to be a calligrapher. Now, this wasn't a new thing. Rulers generally, up until then, had been keen on writing nicely. What was new during the Tang period was, as you might have guessed, various breakthroughs in technology, or maybe better described as fashion. Whereas before, steels, stone or wooden slabs, were generally written in what's known as seal script, an ancient style of writing characters, the emperors of the Tang introduced an altogether more artistic cursive style. This flowing style of writing allowed much more expressiveness to be put into the text. Look at it as going up a gear. No longer was it all about explaining something in text. It was adding an extra dimension of emotion and context to the words. You could see it as almost like that moment when Hollywood suddenly started making color films after all those years of black and white movies. There was also a knock-on effect at this time with the general official style of calligraphy as a result. Interestingly also, because of the combined forces of centralization and inward migration to Chang'an, and outward spread of culture, fashion, style, the Tang found itself unified on so many fronts. Calligraphers from the south, for example, came north, adopted the official style, and suddenly everyone in Tang was following the same rules. The strength of character of the emperor should not be underestimated. Many of the finest calligraphers of the Tang period actually came from the south, but the influence of the court caused them to fall in line. The three most outstanding calligraphers in the early Tang dynasty all came from the south. According to legend, Yu Shinan was one of Emperor Taizong's calligraphy teachers, and they would often write together. Yu Shinan was an official, literati, Confucian scholar, and calligrapher. His uncle served in the Tang imperial court. He is regarded as one of the 4 greatest calligraphers in the early Tang Dynasty. Emperor Taizong once described him as a man of 5 absolute merits, skilled in virtue, honesty, scholarship, literary ability, and calligraphy. So, how best to describe the brushwork of the Tang calligraphers? You might think that an emperor would have a strong, bold hand, but actually Taizong's style was elegant. This elegance may not sit comfortably with the fact that most calligraphers in the Tang dynasty would have had knowledge of the martial arts. There was a blurred distinction between civil and military officialdom. Military officials brushed shoulders with assassins, princes, ambassadors, all of whom might have dabbled in calligraphy. It was not unknown for generals to later become prime ministers. Even today, some practitioners of the art suggest the first rule of calligraphy is to be powerful. What do they mean? You need a strong wrist, as you might develop in swordplay. It's on record that the poet Li Bai learned fencing and that he knew how to wield a sword. But in a way, it makes sense. Think of how soldiers will tell of their battles, especially after a few glasses of wine. They drift into storytelling, poetry, and yes, why not calligraphy, to tell of their brave deeds. Military and culture existed silk glove in gauntlet during the Tang dynasty. There is a saying that goes, in days of old, a gentleman should avoid 3 sharp points: the nib of the scribe's pen, the tip of a soldier's sword, and the sharp tongue of a debater. The 19th century writer Edward Bulwer Lytton wrote, "The pen is mightier than the sword," a sentiment which would not have been lost on the tongue. There is a similar ancient Chinese saying, "Brushwork can be used for swordsmanship." The introduction of cursive script, which meant the speed of writing wasn't uniform, adds to the analogy. It meant the calligraphers could be more robust in their writing. The most famous calligraphers in the Tang dynasty often came from noble families or clans. Each had their own style, mixing power with elegance or simplicity with tradition. And your style was sometimes seen as a reflection of your character, as handwriting might be analysed today. The strength of your brushwork and the artistry define whether you were of upright moral character. One important thing here is that it wasn't always possible to have a good teacher. Such were the sheer numbers of those learning calligraphy. It's not like today when you can summon up a how-to video on the internet. The answer was copying, and very often copying a copy of a copy. A practice which had dangers in its own right. It was fine if you had a good copy of some fine calligraphy to start with, but there would always be subtle changes in the copying, and so several generations later, bad habits might creep in. Buddhist texts, especially, were copied in great numbers by monks. Copies of the entire Buddhist canon were ordered to be taken by imperial decree, and were often the work of many individual calligraphers. According to tradition, the most talented calligraphers would do the first and last scrolls, with the work in between shared out to other scribes. The brush used for sutra copying was different in shape from a regular calligraphy brush, with a much shorter tip. Decorative refinements, such as the use of specially made papers and gold or silver inks, were often used in the copying of religious texts, which you would not find in non-religious texts. Before we finish, let's name-check the famous Tang calligraphers who have gone down in history. Zhang Shu was known for a tipsy cursive style that contrasted to the classic sober style of writing. It is said that whenever Zhang was drunk and painted, his brushes flew and danced with unbridled emotion. Huai Su was even less restrained and was known for his extremely fluid and spontaneous, wild cursive style. The poet Wang Wei once said, "There were paintings in his poems and poems in his paintings." Yu Shinan, who we mentioned earlier, and Ou Yangshun were famous calligraphers in Taizong's court. They served as tutors to the sons of nobility. Their characters were executed with precision and spontaneity. Chu Suiliang had a style that was both solid and firm. His sensitive, delicate style of his later years was described as being like a fragile, elegant lady unable to bear the weight of her own garments. Gao Xian is famous for his 1,000-character essay, which displays alternating lines of regular and running script. Born in Wucheng, present-day Huzhou, Zhejiang province, he was an eminent monk who lived during the mid-Tang Dynasty. Only 243 characters of the original 1,000 characters are left. The 1,000-character essay is regarded as a great calligraphic achievement of the mid-Tang Dynasty. When people talk about the Tang Dynasty as the golden age of Chinese culture, they often praise calligraphy as one of the Tang's crowning achievements. In the Tang Dynasty, the government set up academies for studying calligraphy. Calligraphy was used to sum up a person and was considered as a way of selecting talents. In the National Academy, there were 6 key subjects. Calligraphy was one of them. The whole society, from the emperors down to ordinary people, treated calligraphy with passion. Special thanks go out to San Lian Zhongdu for their help in creating the content for this show. This is Bob Jones. Thanks for listening. Join me again next time.